The pencil trembled like a compass needle seeking true north, hovering above the pristine Red Cross stationery. Hans Müller Carpenter, 26, Bavaria, stared at the blank page spread before him on the wooden mess hall table, his calloused fingers unable to steady the simple instrument that seemed heavier than any rifle he had ever carried. Around him, in the Mississippi spring heat, 200 German prisoners sat in stunned silence, each man clutching identical writing materials, each face bearing the same expression of disbelief. The American interpreter had just finished explaining the impossible. Every prisoner of war could write letters home to Germany, freely, in their own language, without alteration of their words. For soldiers raised on tales of enemy brutality, men who had crossed the Atlantic, expecting humiliation or worse, this moment shattered every assumption they had carried into captivity. They had come from the smoking ruins of Normandy, from the olive groves of Italy where American shells had shattered ancient stones, from the desert sands of North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had finally crumbled. These men bore the scars of defeat, etched not just in their bodies but in their minds, carrying memories of comrades buried in foreign soil and the bitter taste of surrender. The propaganda had been clear and consistent throughout their military service. Americans were brutal capitalists who showed no mercy to prisoners, who violated every principle of civilized warfare. They had been told to expect forced labor in mines, starvation rations, beatings for the smallest infractions. The younger men, barely out of their teens when the war began, had absorbed these warnings with the unquestioning faith of youth. Even the veterans, men who had fought in Poland and France before facing the Allied onslaught, carried these expectations like armor against what seemed inevitable humiliation. During the long journey across the Atlantic in the bellies of Liberty ships, packed together like cargo, they had prepared themselves mentally for what awaited them in America. Some had heard whispered stories of prisoners shot while attempting escape, of camps where German soldiers simply disappeared into the vast American wilderness. Others spoke of forced labor gangs working until they collapsed, of systematic starvation designed to break their spirits before killing their bodies. When the trucks finally deposited them at Camp Shelby, the initial reality had been jarring enough. Clean wooden barracks, arranged in orderly rows, fences that seemed more administrative than punitive, American guards who carried themselves with professional indifference rather than hatred. The food, while modest, was nutritious and regular. The bedding was clean, the latrines functional, the medical care adequate. For men who had spent their final months in Wehrmacht service, subsisting on increasingly meager rations while dodging Allied bombers, these conditions felt almost luxurious. The guards spoke to them in measured tones, issued orders without screaming, and showed no signs of the casual cruelty they had expected. Some prisoners waited for the other shoe to drop, convinced this initial kindness was merely the calm before a storm of brutality. Others began to wonder if everything they had been told about American barbarity had been lies designed to keep them fighting to the death rather than surrendering when defeat became inevitable. But nothing had prepared them for the announcement that came on their third day in captivity. The camp commandant, a middle-aged American colonel with graying temples and wire-rimmed spectacles, entered the mess hall, accompanied by an interpreter and a woman wearing the distinctive armband of the International Red Cross. The prisoners fell silent as the colonel positioned himself before them. "This is in accordance with the Geneva Convention," the commandant announced. "Personal matters pass. Military details do not." The Red Cross woman stepped forward with a gentler tone. "Write like sons and husbands, not like soldiers." The interpreter, a German-American sergeant who spoke their language with only the faintest trace of an accent, stepped forward. His words fell like stones into still water. "Zwei Brief, vier Postkarten, jeden Monat. In Ihrer Sprache," he announced. 2 letters, 4 postcards, each month, in your language." The silence that followed was deafening. Men who had endured artillery barrages without flinching now sat frozen in their seats. Klaus Weber, a 30-year-old mechanic from Dresden, leaned toward his bunkmate and whispered urgently, "This is impossible. They want to make us write propaganda for them." His voice carried the skepticism of a man who had learned to distrust everything during years of military service. Weber had seen too much of war's deception to believe in enemy generosity, had watched too many promises broken and too many friends betrayed by false hope. His companion, 18-year-old farmhand Friedrich Kessler, stared ahead with wide eyes that still held traces of the boy he had been before the war consumed his youth. The young man had been captured during the retreat from Falaise, his unit scattered and broken by the advancing Allied forces. Unlike Weber, Kessler possessed the dangerous optimism of youth, a willingness to hope that made him vulnerable to both disappointment and wonder. His mother had packed his knapsack with trembling hands just 2 years earlier, pressing a small wooden cross into his palm and whispering prayers she hoped would bring him home. The blank sheets of paper lay before them like uncharted territory, promising connection across thousands of miles of ocean and war, yet threatening consequences they could not foresee. The morning light filtered through the barracks windows as Friedrich Kessler sat hunched over his assigned table, the Red Cross stationery spread before him like a battlefield he could not comprehend. His right hand gripped the pencil with the same intensity he had once reserved for his rifle, but the trembling that ran through his fingers made each attempted letter appear shaky and uncertain. For months, these men had spoken only the language of military necessity. Orders barked and received, coordinates called out across battlefields, tactical discussions conducted in the clipped phrases of men who had learned that unnecessary words could mean death. Now, faced with blank paper and the freedom to express themselves, they discovered that the simple act of finding personal words had become monumentally difficult. Friedrich stared at the empty page until his eyes watered, his mind racing through possibilities and fears. He had rehearsed this moment countless times during the sleepless nights since his capture, imagining the relief of telling his mother that he had survived the chaos of Normandy. But now, with pencil poised above paper, every phrase that came to mind seemed inadequate or dangerous. How could he explain that he was well-fed and warm when she might be shivering in the ruins of a bombed German city? How could he describe his captor's unexpected kindness without seeming to betray his own country? The weight of choosing the right words felt heavier than any military equipment he had ever carried. Finally, his hand moved across the page with agonizing deliberation. The young farmhand read aloud in hushed tones, "Liebste Mutter, ich lebe, dearest mother, I am alive." He stopped there, overwhelmed by the simple power of those 3 words. For a moment, he could almost see her face as she would read them, could imagine her tears of relief after months of uncertainty about his fate. At the table beside him, Weber had taken a different approach entirely. His letter began with mechanical precision, the words emerging in the formal language he had learned during his technical training. "I write to inform you that I have been captured by American forces and am being held in accordance with international law." But as he continued, his rigid formality began to crack like ice under spring sunshine. He found himself describing the clean bedding that smelled of soap rather than sweat and fear, the regular meals that arrived without the chaos of artillery bombardments, the absence of the casual cruelty he had expected from his captors. Each admission felt like a small betrayal of everything he had been taught about his enemies. Yet the truth demanded expression. His wife deserved to know that her husband was not suffering the torments they had both imagined during their final embrace before his deployment. The most heartbreaking struggle belonged to Müller, whose wife had been expecting their first child when he departed for France. He had received her final letter just days before the invasion began, her handwriting shaky with excitement, as she described feeling the baby's movements, the way their child seemed to dance inside her when she hummed the old Bavarian lullabies her own mother had sung. Now, nearly a year later, he faced the impossible task of addressing a life he might never have met, a child who could be walking and talking while he sat imprisoned thousands of miles away. The arithmetic of separation was cruel. Every month in captivity represented milestones he would never witness, first words he would never hear, first steps he would never celebrate. The carpenter wrote slowly, "My beloved Greta, if you have given birth, know that my heart is with you and our child every moment." The emotional toll was visible throughout the mess hall, in ways that went beyond tears or trembling hands. Some men wiped their eyes with rough sleeves. Others stared at the ceiling as if seeking divine inspiration for words that seemed impossibly inadequate. A few simply sat frozen, paralyzed by the weight of communication after so many months of enforced silence. The sound of pencils scratching against paper created a strange rhythm, punctuated by occasional sighs, muffled sobs, and the soft rustle of pages being turned. Men, who had learned to suppress emotion as a survival mechanism, now found themselves confronting feelings they had buried beneath layers of military discipline and wartime necessity. The censorship process added another layer of tension. American officers moved through the room, collecting completed letters, their faces professionally neutral, as they scanned each page for prohibited content. The prisoners watched nervously as officials reviewed their words. They waited for the heavy black lines. Most never came. When Friedrich finally completed his letter, his hand was cramped and his shirt damp with perspiration despite the cool morning air. He had managed only half a page, but those few sentences contained more emotional honesty than he had expressed in years of military service. For the first time since their capture, they were no longer simply soldiers or prisoners. They were sons and husbands and fathers again, connected by invisible threads of ink to lives that continued beyond the barbed wire of their captivity. The canvas sacks filled with German letters began their unlikely odyssey in the administrative offices of Camp Shelby, where American military censors worked under fluorescent lights that hummed with bureaucratic efficiency. Each envelope was opened with surgical precision, its contents scrutinized for military intelligence, camp details, or coded messages that might compromise Allied operations. The censors, many of them German-speaking Americans whose families had immigrated decades earlier, wielded black ink pens with the methodical care of postal clerks rather than interrogators, treating each letter as routine correspondence rather than enemy communication. They understood the weight these words carried, the desperate hope contained in every carefully crafted sentence. From Mississippi, the approved letters traveled by military transport to postal sorting facilities in New York and Boston, where they joined massive streams of wartime mail flowing across the Atlantic. A postal clerk, nursing cold thermos coffee at 3 a.m, sorted envelopes by destination with practiced efficiency, each letter requiring documentation and careful routing according to destination. The prisoners back at Camp Shelby could only speculate about this journey. In the evenings, men gathered in small groups on their bunks, sharing rumors and theories about where their words might be traveling. Some had heard whispers that the mail went through Lisbon, following neutral Portuguese shipping routes. Others insisted the letters traveled via Sweden, where Red Cross officials maintained offices specifically for handling prisoner correspondence. Friedrich Kessler found himself obsessed with imagining the path his letter might take. He pictured it riding in a mail truck across the American countryside, perhaps passing through cities whose names he knew only from geography lessons. Then came the terrifying journey across the Atlantic, where German U-boats still prowled despite their diminishing numbers. Would his words survive the crossing that had brought him to captivity? The irony was not lost on him that his letter might travel the same treacherous waters where German submarines continued to hunt Allied shipping, that the very forces he had once served might inadvertently destroy his message of survival. The reality was both more mundane and more remarkable than the prisoners imagined. Their letters rode in sealed diplomatic pouches aboard ships flying neutral flags, protected by international agreements that both sides of the war had agreed to honor. In neutral Switzerland, Red Cross officials sorted thousands of pieces of prisoner mail in warehouses that had been converted into massive sorting facilities. Swiss volunteers, working without payment, read addresses written in dozens of languages, and routed correspondence according to constantly changing territorial boundaries as the Reich's borders contracted under Allied pressure. These volunteers understood they were handling more than simple mail. They were facilitating connections between souls separated by the machinery of war, preserving the human bonds that conflict sought to sever. The most challenging part of the journey came at the German border, where the letters entered a postal system under enormous strain. Allied bombing had destroyed major rail lines and sorting facilities throughout Germany. Postal workers, many of them elderly men and young women who had replaced conscripted soldiers, struggled to maintain delivery services to cities that sometimes no longer existed. Back in Mississippi, the waiting became its own form of psychological torture. Every morning, prisoners scanned the camp gates, hoping to see mail trucks arriving with replies from home. Days stretched into weeks, with no sign of returned correspondence. American guards, observing the prisoners' growing anxiety, occasionally offered reassurances in broken German. "Be patient," one guard told a group of particularly agitated men. "Letters take time in war." The breakthrough in prisoner attitudes came gradually, as weeks passed without evidence of deliberate cruelty or deception. Weber found himself engaging in conversation with an American sergeant who had supervised his work detail in the camp motor pool. "My grandparents came from Bavaria," the sergeant mentioned casually. "My family still gets letters from relatives in Germany through the same Red Cross system." The casual way he discussed this cross-border correspondence, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, gradually eroded Weber's suspicions about American motives. As the letters continued their slow journey toward German destinations, the prisoners at Camp Shelby began to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Their words were genuinely traveling across oceans and borders, carrying proof of their survival to families who might have given them up for dead. The morning of July 15, 1944, began like any other at Camp Shelby, until Sergeant Martinez entered the barracks, carrying a canvas sack that would transform everything the German prisoners thought they understood about their captivity. The bag bore German postal markings, smudged with ink stamps from distant cities, whose names stirred memories of home in men who had resigned themselves to silence. As Martinez began calling out names in his careful pronunciation of German surnames, the barracks fell into a hush so complete that the sound of Mississippi cicadas outside seemed deafening. "Friedrich Kessler," the sergeant announced. The sergeant held up an envelope addressed in handwriting so familiar it made the young farmhand's knees buckle. The letter bore the return address of his family's farm outside Munich, written in his mother's careful script that had guided him through childhood lessons. Kessler stumbled forward on unsteady legs, his hands shaking so violently he could barely accept the precious envelope. Weber received 2 letters simultaneously, one from his wife in Dresden, and another from his younger brother, who was apparently still serving somewhere on the Eastern Front. The mechanic clutched both envelopes against his chest, unable to decide which to open first, tears streaming down his face as he realized that his family not only lived but had received proof of his survival. Müller stood frozen as he stared at an envelope bearing his wife's handwriting, the return address showing that she still lived in their small Bavarian town. The letter felt impossibly light in his hands, yet it carried the weight of months of uncertainty about whether he had become a father. The emotional eruptions were immediate and overwhelming. Kessler collapsed onto his bunk and tore open his mother's letter with trembling fingers, his eyes racing across lines of text that confirmed his deepest hopes and worst fears. The young man read aloud, his voice breaking, "Den Brief kam wie Sonne nach dem langsten Winter." Your letter arrived like sunshine after the longest winter. Kessler continued reading, "I have read it 100 times and carry it in my apron pocket while working in the fields. The Americans who hold you must have kind hearts to allow such words to travel so far." Müller's letter brought revelation that stopped his breath entirely. His wife's careful handwriting described a daughter born 3 months after his departure for France, a child she had named Anna after his mother. Müller read the words aloud. "She has your stubborn chin and your father's blue eyes. When she cries at night, I tell her stories about her papa, who will come home to teach her how to carve wooden toys and sing the old songs. She reaches for your photograph with tiny fingers that already seem to search for you. The joy was tempered by devastating news that reached other prisoners. A veteran from Hamburg opened his letter to discover that his father had been killed during a British bombing raid on the shipyards where he worked. Another soldier learned that his hometown of Cologne had been reduced to rubble, his family scattered as refugees across the countryside. Weber's wife described the hellish reality of Dresden under constant threat of air attack. She wrote of nights spent in basement shelters, of ration cards that provided barely enough food to survive, yet her words also carried stubborn hope. Weber read aloud to his bunkmates, "The Americans who guard you have allowed this miracle of correspondence. Perhaps they are not the monsters we were told to expect. Perhaps when this terrible war ends, decent people on both sides will remember how to be human again." The transformation of the camp atmosphere was visible within hours. Conversations shifted from endless speculation about the war's progress to intimate sharing of family news. Kessler found himself reading passages of his mother's letter aloud to bunkmates who listened with the respectful attention of men hungry for any connection to the world beyond barbed wire. The most profound change occurred in the prisoners' perception of their captors. Weber approached the American sergeant who had delivered the mail and attempted to express gratitude in broken English. "Thank you for letters home," Weber managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. The sergeant, apparently accustomed to such moments, simply nodded and replied, "Your families needed to know you're alive. That's what decent people do." These simple words carried revolutionary implications for men raised on propaganda about American brutality. For the first time since their capture, they understood that they were not forgotten, not abandoned, not cut off from the world that continued to exist beyond the fences of their captivity. The rhythm of mail days became the heartbeat of Camp Shelby, transforming ordinary Tuesdays and Fridays into occasions of breathless anticipation. When Sergeant Martinez appeared with his canvas sacks, men lined up with eager discipline, but their faces betrayed emotions far more complex than hunger. Weber found himself overwhelmed when he received 4 letters simultaneously from different family members. His wife had written twice, describing the daily struggles of survival in Dresden while expressing her amazement that his letters had reached her at all. His mother had sent a long letter filled with neighborhood gossip that seemed precious beyond measure in its ordinariness: who had married, who had moved away, which shops had closed due to the war. His younger sister had included a carefully drawn picture of their family dog, along with a note explaining that the animal still waited by the window each evening, as if expecting Weber's return from his daily work at the factory. The abundance of correspondence felt almost obscene compared to the empty-handed disappointment of men like Private Gunther Schwartz, who stood silent and hollow-eyed as name after name was called, except his own. Yet even those without letters found themselves drawn into the communal experience of connection that radiated through the barracks each evening. These moments of shared intimacy created bonds between men who had previously known each other only as fellow prisoners, fellow soldiers, fellow survivors of a war that had stripped away most other forms of human connection. The subtle transformation in how prisoners related to their American captors became increasingly evident as the weeks progressed. When Martinez handed Weber his latest bundle of mail, the German mechanic looked directly into the American's eyes and said, "Danke schön," with a sincerity that transcended language barriers. The internal resistance to this transformation came primarily from the German officers who recognized the psychological implications of growing sympathy toward their captors. But their words increasingly fell on deaf ears, as more prisoners received tangible proof of their families' survival and gratitude. The letters themselves had become a form of unintentional counter-propaganda that operated more effectively than any Allied leaflet or radio broadcast. When prisoners read their families' expressions of cautious gratitude toward their American captors, the cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore. Some prisoners began to articulate thoughts that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Kessler confided to his bunkmates that he was beginning to question everything he had been told about the war's purpose and Germany's enemies. If the Americans can show such humanity to prisoners, Kessler wondered aloud, what does that suggest about the cause we fought for? The mail system had created an unexpected form of psychological investment in captivity that served American interests while genuinely benefiting the prisoners and their families. Men who might have risked dangerous escape attempts now calculated that maintaining good behavior was essential to preserving their communication lifeline. Years later, when the war had become memory and the prisoners had returned to rebuild their shattered homeland, the stories they told their children invariably returned to those fragile envelopes that had crossed oceans to reach their hands in a Mississippi prison camp. Veterans who had endured the horror of Stalingrad, the chaos of Normandy, and the grinding defeat of the Reich's final collapse would pause when describing their captivity, their voices softening as they remembered the moment when American guards had called their names and handed them proof that love could survive even global warfare. The immediate impact of the correspondence system had extended far beyond the prisoners themselves, rippling through German communities where families had clung to hope through the darkest months of the war's end. In bombed-out cities across the Reich, mothers had gathered neighbors to read aloud letters from captured sons, sharing the miraculous news that American captivity meant survival rather than death. These readings became informal ceremonies of relief that sustained entire communities through the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Weber's wife had kept every letter he sent from Camp Shelby, preserving them in a wooden box that survived the firebombing of Dresden in February 1945. When he finally returned home in 1946, she showed him how she had shared his descriptions of American treatment with neighbors whose own sons were still missing. His letters had become evidence that capture by Allied forces offered hope rather than despair, influencing families to pray for their soldiers' surrender rather than death in hopeless final battles. The children who had grown up with absent fathers found their understanding of the war shaped by these letters from captivity. Muller's daughter Anna, who had taken her first steps while her father wrote from Mississippi, grew up hearing her mother read passages that described American kindness toward German prisoners. These stories planted seeds of reconciliation that would flourish during Germany's reconstruction, when former enemies became allies in the face of new global challenges. The psychological transformation experienced by the prisoners themselves proved even more profound and lasting. Men who had entered captivity as committed soldiers of the Reich emerged with fundamentally altered perspectives on democracy, individual dignity, and the treatment of enemies. Kessler returned to his family farm with stories of American guards who had shown respect for his humanity even while holding him prisoner. These experiences influenced his participation in local government during the Allied occupation, when his voice became one of many advocating for cooperation rather than resistance. The correspondence system had demonstrated the power of simple human communication to bridge ideological divides that had seemed insurmountable. Families who had received uncensored letters, written in their own language by loved ones held in enemy hands, understood that their captors possessed a concept of mercy that transcended national boundaries. The letters themselves became family treasures passed down through generations, physical evidence of humanity's capacity to maintain civilized behavior even during civilization's darkest hours. Grandchildren who never knew the war learned from faded ink on Red Cross stationery that their grandfathers had been treated with unexpected kindness by men they had been taught to hate. A wooden box in Dresden still smells faintly of smoke and glue. Inside, Red Cross paper, faded ink, a pencil line that once shook steady now finding north. Those fragile envelopes that had crossed Atlantic waters during the war's darkest hours became symbols of humanity's capacity to maintain dignity, even when nations descended into barbarism. The simple act of allowing captured enemies to communicate freely with their families demonstrated that democratic societies possessed moral resources that totalitarian regimes could never comprehend or replicate. The legacy of those carefully written letters transcended the immediate relief they brought to separated families. They became proof that even in war's most brutal moments, when propaganda painted enemies as monsters and survival seemed to require abandoning every civilized instinct, simple human gestures could plant seeds of reconciliation that would flourish long after the guns fell silent. For the German prisoners who never forgot the freedom to write and be heard, those words on Red Cross stationery remained the miracle that transformed captivity into the first step toward a more peaceful world.